Hello. This will be a really short video, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take up answers to the homework that was given to you on your first, I guess, day of lessons for the March period. Your lesson looked at conformity and in particular the Stanley-Milgram experiment, and the homework that you had to read, which is this sheet right here. So hopefully you've read through it and done the answers. It looked at a pretty important yet simple study that was done by psychologist Soloman, wherein he tried to determine how group pressures may impact people's decision-making abilities. The experiment, as you read, was fairly straightforward. In the experiment, people were put into a group setting surrounded by actors. The actors in that particular setting were instructed to regularly get an answer to a problem or series of problems wrong. And then the person who was the essential, guinea pig, the person being tested on, was asked their answers. And the question was, if you were surrounded by a unanimously wrong answer repeated series of these questions. And you can see the particular test was you had lines and you had to determine which line was the same length as the one on the left. So 3 is the same as A. Anybody can do that on their own. The question was, would you be able to persuade people to make wrong answers if the group around them was getting it wrong? And as Asche was able to see, people would never make mistakes on their own so long as they had reasonable competency, which everyone doing the test did. But if you put a person into a particular situation wherein they had a group around them and everybody was getting it wrong, then many people would actually give a false answer, maybe not immediately, but over time. And thus the conclusion, of course, was that there was conformity at play and people were pressured into things. I'm going to go through the questions, go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'll just quickly give you a summation of the answers you probably should have had, although a few of them are a little bit open-ended. First question, it asks, why didn't Asche tell the subjects being experimented on what the real purpose of the experiment was? And then secondly, was this a fair or morally right thing to do? This is actually very similar. It overlaps with the Milgram experiment, which you heard about in the lesson I prepared today. And there's a reason why I assigned it today. It's because they connect this way. Generally speaking, the reason he didn't tell people is obvious. If you told a person that you're surrounded by actors, then they wouldn't really have group pressure anymore, because then they'd know that the fix was in. You couldn't do that. That would wreck the experiment. And so, yeah, I mean, you potentially were going to embarrass a person who at the end of things realized that, when they looked at this line and they're surrounded by, people saying 2 is the same as A, and some of these people actually said, okay, fine, then the answer that's correct is 2, and they eventually gave into that group pressure. They may have been embarrassed and they may have been a little ashamed of their foolishness. The reality is that you had to make that particular or provide that ruse, because if you didn't, the experiment wouldn't work. Is it unethical? I would tend to argue that not really. I mean, what's the greatest harm that's happening here? A person feels a little silly, a little not as intelligent as they want to. It's not really that big a deal. In an experiment, and I think this is important, I'm going to note this a little bit in your homework and your work tomorrow. You don't have to tell everybody everything you're going to do. You certainly aren't going to explain the whole purpose for the experiment and all the particular hypotheses you have. That's not going to ever be authentic. That would ruin the experiment through corrupting the data. You have to give them a reasonable idea of what they're going to be asked to do, and certainly you have to declare the risks. But given there wasn't a lot of risk here, and given you needed proper real responses, I think it was an appropriately set up experiment. And you may find people who disagree, but I don't think there's really many ethical questions of substance here. It's a pretty fair experiment. Why was a control group needed in the experiment? What did it show? We talked a little bit about this in a couple of the classes, maybe not every one before the break. I actually mentioned this experiment as well. When you do experiments, and this is not just true for psychological research, it's also true for scientific studies, drug experiments, so on and so forth. One of the things that you have to account for is the fact that when you have a person do something, the variable you're trying to test out in terms of whether it's impacting behavior, it may be the thing that's changing a person's behavior, but there's lots of other things that may be at play. Simply doing an experiment and doing certain actions within an experiment may actually psychologically change a person's perception of an experience. To give you an example of that, and you've probably heard of this before, when you're looking at drugs, they always have to test against the tendency that people have when they're given a pill to deal with their affliction, to think that the pill, because it was given by a person who's a leader with authority and a person who knows what they're doing, will work. That conformity actually sort of applies to the way you perceive things. They call that the placebo effect. Sometimes you could give a person a pill of sugar and nothing else in it, and they may feel like that drug is doing something to, cure their depression or to cure a particular medical ailment they have, maybe allergies or whatever. And so what you actually have to do to test whether or not a real drug is actually working is you actually have to test not just against, is it making people feel well compared to what they did before they didn't have the drug, but actually against the control. And the way a control would work in those circumstances is that the control group actually would, in that particular instance, not get a drug, but think they were getting a real drug. So they'd get a pill, but they wouldn't actually get the drugs. You would measure how much they felt like it was doing whatever it's supposed to do, and then you would compare to that standard the real drug and see if there's a notable difference. If there's a slight bump in both cases, you may just declare that there's probably not much of a benefit and it's just a general placebo effect. Whereas if one of the drugs is doing very, very good work and it's considerably above the group that's controlled, that's not aware because you don't tell them that they're the control, then in that case you might actually declare, oh, this drug's actually working. Coming back to the Soloman Asche experiment, in this particular case, the idea behind things was that if you had a control, then you could at least prove that if people were making mistakes, it wasn't because they didn't know what they were doing. And so the control group was a group that was outside the actual group dynamic. They never made errors because any halfway, sensible, intelligent person can answer something like this. It's the simplest problem ever if you have a basic sense of proportion and geometry. And so that proved that, okay, anybody can do this. It's not that people who make mistakes are just not understanding the question. And then when you put people into a room where there were various variables testing their conformity and they did make mistakes, then you can actually start to declare that, okay, the change in variable is what's actually causing this to occur. It's not just that the person before anything happened couldn't answer the question. The third question, how is the experimental method organized so that group pressure was felt by the person experimented on? Well, a couple of things. First thing, they repeated the test many times over. So even if a person didn't cave in quite at first, there was a repeated nature of the experiment. The other thing was that they didn't just put the person first in line because that might be, easy. There's no pressure there. You're the first to go. They put the person at the end of the question set. So all of the actors were asked first, and that created a real pressure against them. It was sort of the weight of the mob, everybody around them thinking a certain way. Well, that wave is already moving. You may not want to go the other direction. The other factor, of course, was that when they did the experiment, not only did they make the person go last, but they also had to declare publicly. And again, that might have made the person feel a little bit uncomfortable. Couple of other questions here. Number 4, suppose this experiment were redone with slight changes, predict how it would affect the level of conformity in the experiment. Well, first and foremost, if you have a situation where the person being experimented on did not have to say the answers but could declare them in private, we've talked about that before. We talked a little bit about that before the break. If you didn't have to publicly do things, it would remove a lot of the conformity pressures because you wouldn't have to feel like you were out of place. You wouldn't have to doubt yourself in terms of how you were perceived by other people. There's a good chance that if you were doing this privately, you would see far less conformity than you do when you have to publicly declare. It's the reason why when we look at things like, for example, voting, unlike years ago in the past where you'd have sort of, you pull up the hustings and you'd have people, get up on their soapboxes and promote their parties, and then everybody would have to hold up their hands and vote. And that did happen in a lot of democratic societies for years. Today, you go behind a little closed box, you fill out your ballot, and the reason, of course, that you do so is because We don't want that sort of pressure of the masses to impact your thinking. So of course, doing it privately would probably reduce the conformity. I don't think there's any doubt. The second question, one of the fake participants, what would happen if some of them started to give the correct answer? Well, again, it would probably reduce the pressures for conformity. One of the pressures we talked about before the March break was the fact that when you're in a room where everything is unanimous, it's much harder to go against a room where nobody is deviating than when there is deviance. Because the minute you start to introduce deviance, and the more people who are actually giving correct answers, the more that would be there, then it's much easier to sort of voice your views because you're not out of place. I guess an example you might give would be if you were in a situation where socially you were in a room full of people who were I don't know, voted for the NDP party and you were conservative, you'd probably start to feel uncomfortable voicing your views if every single one of those people was critical of your particular party that you affiliated with or intended to vote for and didn't share your views. It's uncomfortable. It'd be unnerving for the person. Whereas if you had a room where a third of the people tended to vote for the NDP, a third tended to vote for conservative, and a third tended to vote for liberal, and people actively share their views, but there's a diversity of views, it's a lot easier to sort of voice your particular perspective there because you're not really going against any one sort of wave of emotion. There's a range of things there, and it actually sort of is an environment that encourages I guess a little bit more free thought. Ideological diversity, I at least think, is a good thing. Certainly, it makes people feel more comfortable if they don't fit in with the norm. The last question: what factors affecting conformity were tested? Again, I've spoken about these, but I'll reiterate. First is how much does being in public impact your, I guess, tendency to conform? The second question that was answered by this particular experiment deals with the nature of what happens when there's unanimous sort of agreement around you. And then the final thing in this particular case was it also sort of showed how a person might conform when they're facing sort of a doubt. And that's created by the repetition. The fact that you keep getting the answer wrong or at least different than an entire room full of people. It's not just that there's a group pressure, but there's that growing sense that I'm missing something. In fact, oftentimes people who did this experiment, I think it says it in the reading, they got answers right at first in a few cases, but eventually their willpower caved in the face of that constant isolation, and they eventually just sort of changed their view. So those are the answers to the Asche experiment. It's a much simpler experiment than the Milgram one, but still a fairly important one that generally did a lot to prove how conformity is a very, very real thing. And it's a very easily replicated experiment as well. It's been done many times in the years since, and of course, almost every time, well, not everybody falls for the trick. A lot of people do, and you get similar kinds of results. Okay,